The bells of the small grey chapel had been rung too early, and now they would not stop. They rang over a churchyard crowded with carriages, over a congregation in its finest silk, over the empty place at the altar rail, where a bride was meant to be standing, and was not. The groom waited in his pale blue coat with his gloved hands folded and his jaw set, and behind him the guests began to turn in their pews, slowly at first, the way a field turns under a changing wind. There was a folded square of paper resting on the cushion, where she should have knelt. No one had seen her place it. No one had seen her leave. The clergyman cleared his throat and looked toward the side door for the third time. A footman went out into the bright October morning and came back shaking his head. And in the second pew, an older gentleman in gray watched the folded paper with the stillness of a man watching a fuse, and did not move toward it, and did not look away. Her name was Eudora, and she had not run from fear. That was what the morning would refuse to understand. She had spent the better part of the night deciding, and the deciding had aged her in a way the candle could not show, and by the time the gray light came over the marsh, she had known exactly what the paper would say and exactly what it would cost her to leave it behind. She set it on the cushion with steady hands. Then she went out through the vestry while the organ found its first chord, and the cold took her breath, and she did not look back at the chapel that was supposed to be the end of her story. To understand why a woman would walk out of her own wedding into a wet October field, one must go back 2 years, to the spring she lost everything in the space of a single fortnight. Eudora Linley had been raised at Linley Park, a modest estate of good land and bad drainage on the edge of the Alswick marshes, where her father had taught her to read a ledger before she could properly read a novel. Sir Whitfield Linley was not a wealthy man, and never pretended to be one. He was a careful one. He kept his own accounts, walked his own fields, knew the name of every tenant, and the age of every roof, and he had raised his only daughter to do the same because he had no son and saw no reason to apologize for that. By the time Eudora was 20, she could tell to the shilling what the estate owed and what it was owed, and she had done it all at her father's elbow in the small wood-paneled study that smelled of pipe smoke and tallow and the river. She was 23 now, tall for a woman and straight-backed, with a plain, dark coil of hair and gray eyes too direct for the drawing rooms her aunt kept trying to push her into. She had her father's habit of looking at a thing until she understood it. To the families of the Alswick neighborhood, who had decided long ago that a girl who kept ledgers and walked her own land was no proper kind of lady at all, she was a curiosity to be managed and married off. What she did not yet know, in those last good years, was that her father's careful accounts would one day be the only thing standing between a murderer and a clean escape. Sir Whitfield fell ill in the early spring 2 years past. It came on slowly, a heaviness in the limbs, a sourness in the stomach, a tremor in the hand that had always been so steady over the ledger. The Alswick apothecary, a sober man named Brierly, with ink-stained fingers and an honest face, came twice a week and frowned over the symptoms and could make nothing certain of them. Sir Whitfield grew thinner. He grew confused in the evenings, and in the last week he could not hold a pen at all, which grieved him more than the pain did, for a man who has kept his own accounts for 40 years does not like to die, unable to sign his name. He died on a wet morning, much like the one Eudora would later walk into. She was holding his hand. His last words were not tender ones, for he had never been a tender man, yet they were the truest thing he ever gave her. "Watch the books, Eudora," he said, his voice no more than a breath. "The books do not lie even when men do." She had thought then that he was wandering. She would spend 2 years learning that he was not. The grief was bad enough. The fortnight that followed was worse, for it was then that Sir Conrad Hadley appeared at Linley Park, with a sheaf of documents and a face arranged into sorrow. Sir Conrad was a neighbor of long standing, a baronet of considerable means, whose estate marched along the western boundary of Linley Park where the good grazing lay. He was a heavy, deliberate man of perhaps 50, soft-spoken, with pale eyes and a way of holding very still while he talked that made people lean in to listen. He had been, he reminded Eudora gently, her father's friend. He produced documents to prove also her father's creditor. There was a bond, he explained, a private loan made some 3 years before and never spoken of, secured against the Western Fields and a portion of the house. Sir Whitfield, being proud, had not wished his daughter to know the estate was encumbered. The debt was real all the same, and the interest had run, and Sir Conrad was very sorry. Yet the land would have to be settled. Eudora asked to see the books. She remembered the small pause before he answered. She would think of it often later. He told her with great kindness that the relevant accounts had been kept privately by her father, and seemed to have been mislaid in the confusion of his illness. He was sure they would turn up. The bond itself in any case was witnessed and sealed and beyond dispute, and there was no use in a young woman of her situation distressing herself with figures she could not be expected to follow. She had followed figures since she was 9 years old. She was also 23, newly orphaned, unmarried, and a woman, and the law in the neighborhood agreed that her understanding of her own father's estate was a thing of no weight at all. The bond was witnessed. The witness, a lawyer's clerk named Foley, swore to her father's signature. And within the month the western fields of Linley Park belonged to Sir Conrad Hadley, and Eudora, to settle the remainder, was obliged to give up the house itself and remove to the home of her aunt in the village, with little more than her clothes, a small annuity, and the things from her father's study that no one had thought worth taking. To the neighborhood she was simply the unfortunate Miss Linley, ruined by her father's improvidence, a cautionary tale to be pitied at tea. "She is too proud to be sensible," her aunt said of her more than once in the close warm parlor with the curtains half drawn. "The girl will not be helped." That was the first time the words were said aloud, and they were said as a private complaint between a woman and her embroidery, with Eudora sitting 3 feet away and pretending not to hear. The verdict sat in the warm parlor air like smoke. She would hear it twice more before she was through, in 2 other rooms and 2 other mouths, and each time it would mean a little less to her and cost her a little more. She took her grief into the back bedroom of her aunt's house, and she took with her the contents of her father's study. And among those contents, in a trunk that no one had thought to examine, were her father's account books. Not the polite ledgers he kept for show, the real ones. The private books in which Sir Whitfield Linley, who did not trust easily and kept his own counsel, had recorded every shilling that came into Linley Park, and every shilling that left it, in his own cramped hand, for 40 years. There was no bond in them, there was no loan from Sir Conrad Hadley, there was no encumbrance on the western fields. The books did not lie. Eudora sat with that knowledge through a long, cold autumn, and did not know what to do with it. A young woman's word against a baronet's sealed bond was nothing. A trunk of private ledgers, easily called forgeries themselves, against a witnessed document sworn by a respectable clerk, was nothing. She had the truth and no means to make the world look at it. And she had learned in the hardest possible way that the truth without power is only a private grief. So she kept the books and read them until she knew them by heart, and weighed it without any clear idea of what she was waiting for, because her father had told her to watch them, and watching was the only thing left to her. This was a quiet kind of ruin, and there is no use pretending otherwise. There were no duels in it, and no galloping horses. There was only a young woman, a trunk of old ledgers, and a wrong the whole world had agreed to call settled. Stay with her, all the same, because the thing about a careful woman is that the careless never see her coming. The second spring brought a courtship she had not sought. Sir Conrad Hadley had a nephew, his late sister's son, a young gentleman named Percival Sturry, whom he had raised since boyhood, and to whom he was guardian, and the neighborhood understood, intended heir. Percival was 23, fair and amiable, and not unkind, with soft hands and an easy laugh and a fondness for sporting prints. He had no particular vices and no particular substance, and he did as his uncle told him because it had never occurred to him to do otherwise. And in the second spring after Sir Whitfield's death, his uncle told him to marry Eudora Linley. It was, the neighborhood agreed, an act of uncommon generosity. By marrying his heir to the dispossessed daughter, Sir Conrad restored her to her old home and quieted any lingering awkwardness about the manner of his acquiring it. The aunt was beside herself with relief. The girl she had despaired of was to be a baronet's nephew's wife after all, mistress of the very house she had lost. Eudora understood it differently. A man does not marry his heir to the daughter of a man he has wronged out of generosity. He does it to bind her. A wife cannot testify against her husband's family. A wife, restored to comfort and gratitude, does not dig through old ledgers. The marriage was a seal upon the grave, and she saw it clearly, and she very nearly refused. She did not refuse, at first, for a reason she was not proud of. She wanted to go home, to walk the fields, and stand in the small wood-paneled study, and some weak and tired part of her whispered that perhaps the truth could stay in the trunk, that perhaps a comfortable peace was worth more than a justice she could never win. She let the courtship proceed. She let the banns be read. And she might have gone through with it, and this would be a smaller story. Except that in the third week of the engagement she went up to Briarwood Hall to be shown the rooms that would be hers, and met the man who was visiting next door. His name was Gareth, and he was the Earl of Daventry, and he had come into the Auswick country to settle the affairs of his late brother's small property at Hartsell, which lay just beyond Briarwood along the river road. He was a tall man of 32, dark-haired, with a hard, clean jaw, and eyes the grey of slate before rain, and he wore his mourning plainly, and spoke seldom, and watched everything. He had been a serving officer until his brother's death made him an earl, and gave him a title he had never wanted, and a grief he could not put down. The neighborhood found him cold. Eudora found him, on first meeting, to be a man looking at the world the way she looked at a ledger, as though he were adding up columns no one else could see. They met across the gravel of the Briarwood Drive, where he had come to call on Sir Conrad on some matter of a boundary, and where she had come, on her aunt's arm, to be inspected as a future tenant of the house. Sir Conrad made the introductions with smooth pleasure. "My nephew's intended," he said. "The late Sir Whitfield Linley's girl. Come back to us at last." And Eudora watched the Earl of Daventry's face do something very slight when her father's name was spoken, a small stillness around the eyes, gone before anyone but she could have marked it. He bowed to her correctly. He said he had known her father a little, years before, in another county. And he said nothing else, and his face gave away nothing else. But she carried that small stillness home with her and turned it over all night, because she had spent 2 years learning to read the things men did not say. What neither of them said on that gravel drive was that the Earl of Daventry had not come into the Auswick country only to settle his brother's affairs. That belongs further on. He came to call at her aunt's house 3 days later, which was not at all the thing for a man to do toward another man's intended, and the aunt was so flustered by an earl on her doorstep that she did not think to forbid it. He sat in the close, warm parlor and drank a cup of weak tea, and asked Eudora, with no preamble at all, whether her father had kept his own accounts. She set down her own cup very carefully. She said that he had. She asked why an earl should care. And Gareth looked at her with those slate-gray eyes and said, his voice low, that her father had once done his brother a kindness involving a question of money, years before, and that he had reason lately to wish he had paid better attention to it. Then he changed the subject, and asked after the weather, and left within the quarter hour. He had planted something, though, and she knew it, and she lay awake again that night with the trunk at the foot of her bed seeming to hum. She did not go to him. She was an engaged woman, and she knew exactly what the neighborhood would make of any private word between them. He came to her instead, in the only honorable way left, by accident, on purpose, in the lending library at Auswick, where she went on Thursdays. He was standing among the histories with a book he plainly was not reading, and when she came down the narrow aisle he did not pretend surprise. He said her name once, quietly, Miss Linley, and asked whether she had ever wondered how a careful man came to die so suddenly of a stomach he had never complained of in his life. She had wondered for 2 years and had never once said it aloud to a living soul, because to say it aloud was to be the proud, unbalanced Miss Linley, who could not accept her ruin. To hear it in another voice, a steady, cool voice, that was not mad and not pitying, was very nearly more than she could bear. She gripped the edge of the shelf. He saw it. He did not touch her, though she felt the readiness in him, the way one feels heat from a banked fire. He only stood close in the narrow aisle and waited, and the warm dust and the smell of old paper closed around them. And for the first time in 2 years, Eudora Linley was not alone with the thing she knew. "Come outside," he said to her. It was not a request. It was one of those plain commands she would learn he gave only when he meant to put himself between a person and harm. She went. In the lane behind the library, with the autumn light slanting low, and a cart rumbling somewhere out of sight, he told her what he had come to find. His brother Marcus, the man whose death had made him an earl, had not been the careless wastrel the family lawyers described. In the months before he died, Marcus had been gathering evidence concerning a series of small, respectable frauds along the river counties, false bonds sworn against the estates of the recently dead, witnessed by a clerk who could be bought, executed against families too grieved or too powerless to fight. He had a name. He had begun, with a magistrate's quiet blessing, to assemble the proof. And then he had taken ill, suddenly, and died within the fortnight, and his papers had been found in disorder, with the most important among them missing. The name in his brother's notes was Hadley. Eudora stood in the lane and felt the ground of 2 years rearrange itself beneath her. She told him then in a low, fast voice, everything. The bond that had never existed. The mislaid books that were not mislaid because she had them. The 40 years of accounts in her father's own hand that showed no debt to any Hadley living. The clerk named, Foley, who had sworn to a signature her father could not have made, because by then his hand could not hold a pen. And Gareth listened with that terrible stillness, and when she finished he said very quietly that he believed her, and that those were the first words anyone had said to her in 2 years that she had not had to fight to be allowed to say. Belief was not proof, however, and proof was the whole of the problem. The difficulty they faced was a real one, and it is worth setting down plainly. Sir Conrad Hadley was not a careless villain. He was a careful one, as careful in his way as Sir Whitfield had ever been. He had not left the false bond lying about. The original, the sealed document on which everything turned, was kept in the strong box at Briarwood Hall, in the study Eudora would soon be mistress of and might never be permitted to enter. The clerk Foley, the only living witness to the forgery, had been settled comfortably in a position in another county, and had every reason to keep his oath. And the slow, sour illness that had carried off 2 careful men within a year left no mark a coroner 2 years dead could be made to read. Sir Conrad had built his frauds the way a good mason builds a wall, and he protected them the same way, and he had been doing it long enough to be very good at it. Worse, he was watchful. In the weeks since the Earl of Daventry had come into the country asking after Boundaries and his late brother's affairs, Sir Conrad had grown quietly attentive. He had let it be known that Marcus of Hartsell had been an unstable young man whose papers were the ravings of a debtor, and he had moved up the wedding from the spring to October, then to 3 weeks off with smooth explanations about the season, and his nephew's impatience. Eudora understood the move for what it was. Once she was Percival Sturry's wife, her father's books became a wife's hysteria, the Earl's questions a rival's slander, and the seal on the grave was set forever. Sir Conrad was not panicking, he was tidying. That was the most frightening thing about him. The dismissive label found her a second time, in those weeks, no longer a private complaint, but a public one. At a card party at Briarwood, with 24 of the neighborhood present, Sir Conrad himself said it, gently, in answer to some remark of Eudora's about the management of the western fields. "She has her father's odd notions about land," he said, smiling. "And a young woman who fancies she understands a steward's business is, I am afraid, too proud to be sensible." He said it the way one excuses a child. The table laughed warmly on his side, and Eudora let them, because she had learned that a woman who protests the label only fastens it tighter. She did meet the Earl's eyes across the room, and saw the small muscle move in his jaw, and understood that he had heard the cruelty under the courtesy, and was holding himself very still indeed. They could not meet openly. So they met as the careful meet, in plain sight and by arrangement, that looked like accident. He walked the river road on the mornings. She walked it. He sent her through Brierly, who had loved her father, a folded note that said only a date and the word courage. And in the small stolen conversations of those 3 weeks, 2 people who had each spent years being the only one in the room who saw clearly found that they were no longer the only one. He told her about the war a little, and about a brother he had failed to take seriously until it was too late. The guilt in it so plain and so unspoken that she ached for him. She told him about the study that smelled of pipe smoke and the father who had taught a girl to keep books. They did not speak of love. There was no room in those 3 weeks for so large a word. Once in the lane, when a gust took her bonnet, and he caught it and put it back into her hands, his fingers stayed a half-second too long against her gloved ones, and neither of them moved, and the cold morning held its breath around them, and that half-second said everything the large word would have. The plan they made was hers in the end, and it was built on the only weapon she had ever owned. She knew the books, and she knew the shape of the fraud itself, the way it must have been done. Because a forged bond is still an entry in the world, and every entry leaves a shadow somewhere. The false loan, had it ever been a real transaction, would have to appear in Sir Conrad's own accounts as money paid out. It would not. A man does not pay out £3,000. He never lent. Somewhere in the Hadley ledgers there would be a hole where the money should have been, and a careful man's own books would convict him out of his own hand, if only they could be read by someone who knew exactly what was missing. Eudora knew exactly what was missing, and in 3 weeks she would be living at Briarwood Hall, with the keys of the mistress and the strong box in the study behind a door that was hers. That was the trap she meant to walk into. She would marry Percival Sturry, become mistress of Briarwood, and from inside the house take the proof that would hang his uncle. It was cold, and it was clever, and it asked her to bind herself for life to a man she did not love, in order to undo a man she meant to destroy. It was Brierly who carried her the last voicing of the old verdict. 2 mornings before the wedding, his ink-stained hands turning his hat in her aunt's doorway. He had been in the tap-room at Auswick, he said, and had heard a friend of Sir Conrad's laugh over the match, and call the Linley girl a fortunate creature to be taken in at all, for she had always been too proud to be sensible, and a man wanted patience to manage a wife like that. Brierly repeated it with shame in his face, as though the carrying of it were his own fault. Eudora thanked him, and did not flush. The label had been a private complaint, then a public courtesy, and now a stranger's joke passed round a fire, and in all 3 rooms it had described a woman the speakers had never once troubled to see. Gareth would not let her do it. They argued in the lane on the morning of the second to last day, the only true quarrel they ever had. In low voices, with their hands at their sides like 2 people discussing the weather for any watching window. He told her the plan was sound, and that he would die before he let her carry it out. A marriage, he said, was not a tool to be picked up and set down. She was proposing to spend her whole life as the price of 2 years of justice, and he would rather lose the case entirely than buy it at that cost. She told him he had no right to an opinion on whom she married. He agreed that he had no right. He said it anyway. And when she demanded to know what he proposed instead, he was silent a long moment, and then said, his voice level, that he proposed to be her witness. If she would give him 3 days, he would take her father's books and his brother's notes to the magistrate at the county seat, a man named Garnett, whom his brother had trusted, and lay it open, and ask for a search of Briarwood under the law, before the wedding and not after, so that she would never have to set foot in that house as anyone's wife at all. It was a worse plan than hers. It was slower. It depended on a magistrate believing an earl over a baronet, and it might fail and leave her ruined and unwed both. She told him so. He did not argue. He only looked at her with those slate-gray eyes and said that some things were not to be done even to win, and that her whole life was one of them, and that he would rather she were proud and free than sensible and his enemy's wife. And Eudora, who had heard that same charge laid against her in 3 rooms now by everyone who had ever claimed to care for her, stood in the cold lane and understood that this hard, silent man had just used the very word they used to condemn her and turned it into something to mean that her pride was the truest thing about her and worth protecting at any cost. She did not weep. She was not a woman who wept easily. Something in her that had been clenched for 2 years came quietly loose all the same. She gave him the books that night, through Brearley, and she let him ride for the county seat, and she did not tell him that she had already decided she could not wait on a magistrate's pleasure with the wedding 2 days off, and that if his slow, lawful way failed, she meant to fall back on her own. He reached Garnett. The magistrate, who had indeed trusted Marcus and grieved his death as more than an accident, read the books through a long night with a candle and a frown, and said at the end of it that there was a case, a real case, but that a sealed and witnessed bond could not be set aside on a daughter's private ledgers alone. He would need the original in Sir Conrad's strongbox, or the clerk Foley to recant. He could grant a search, but a search announced was a search defeated, for the false bond could be in the fire before the constable reached the gate. They needed Sir Conrad to produce the original himself. In a moment he could not prepare for, before witnesses he could not buy. The dark of it came on the wedding morning, and it came in the cruelest possible shape, which was the shape of the plan working too late. Gareth rode back through the night with a magistrate's warrant in his coat, and a constable 2 hours behind him, meaning to reach Owswick before the ceremony, meaning to stop it. The river road flooded in the autumn rains, though, as it always did, the very bad drainage Sir Whitfield had warned of for 40 years, and the ford at Hartshill was impassable, and the Earl of Daventry sat his horse in the grey dawn before a churning brown river that he could not cross with a warrant in his pocket that was worth nothing on the wrong bank. And he did not know, could not know, that on the far side a bride was dressing for a wedding she had every intention of walking out of. For Eudora had made her own decision in the night, alone, the way she had made every decision since her father died. She did not know whether Gareth had succeeded. She knew only that if she stood at that altar and said the words, she lost forever the one freedom her pride had left her, and that her own cold, clever inside plan asked a price she had finally decided she would not pay. He had told her some things were not to be done, even to win. She had not believed him at the time. She believed him now. And so she sat at the little writing desk in her aunt's back bedroom in the hour before dawn. And she wrote in her father's own cramped, careful hand, which she had inherited along with his books, the note that would name the real killer of 2 careful men. She did not write it for the chapel. She wrote it for the magistrate, knowing that whatever happened to her, the words would survive her, and could not be called hysteria once they were set down plain. She wrote that Sir Whitfield Linley had owed no debt to any man living, that the bond sworn against his estate was a forgery, witnessed falsely by the clerk Foley, and that the proof of it lay in the absence of any matching payment in Sir Conrad Hadley's own accounts, where £3,000 said to be lent had never once gone out. She wrote that the same hand had served a gentleman named Marcus of Hartshill the same way, and that both men had died careful and sudden of an illness that left no mark, within a year of each other and within reach of the same neighbor. And she wrote at the end that she would not marry into the family that had killed her father to buy his silence, and that she left this paper in the sight of God and the parish, so that no one could afterward say she had run from shame, for she ran from nothing. She signed it with her full name. Then she carried it to the chapel before the guests arrived, set it on the cushion where the bride would kneel, and went out through the vestry into the cold. That is where this story began. The bells ringing too long, the empty altar rail, the folded paper no one had seen her leave. It was Sir Conrad himself who could not bear it. He had watched the paper from the second pew with his pale eyes, and as the murmur in the chapel rose and the clergyman dithered and the footman came back shaking his head, he understood that an unread document in a public place was a fuse he could not leave burning. He rose, with every appearance of a guardian's distressed concern, crossed to the altar rail and took up the folded paper, meaning surely to read it privately and make it disappear. He had 30 years of practice in making inconvenient documents disappear. The chapel was full, however, and a baronet, rising at his nephew's abandoned wedding to seize a paper from the altar, is a thing 200 eyes will watch. And the magistrate, Garnet, was in that chapel. He had ridden through the night by the upper bridge, while the Earl was stranded at the lower ford, and he had come quietly into the back of the church, meaning only to witness whether the wedding went forward, and he was on his feet and down the aisle before Sir Conrad had the paper half unfolded, asking, in the clear carrying voice of a man who holds the king's commission, what it was that Sir Conrad Hadley found so urgent in a letter not addressed to him. The room went still, the way a room goes still when the social weather changes all at once. What happened next happened slowly, and Eudora was not there to see it, and she would hear it told a dozen ways before she pieced together the truth. Sir Conrad did not crumble. That is the thing that made his fall a real defeat, and not a lucky accident. He was the most dangerous kind of guilty man, the kind who was prepared for the worst morning of his life and rehearsed it. He surrendered the paper with a baronet's wounded dignity, read it standing before the magistrate and the congregation, and his soft voice did not shake. He pronounced it the spiteful invention of a jilted, unbalanced young woman, the same proud girl who had never accepted her father's improvidence, who had now shamed his nephew, and slandered the guardian who had tried only to do her kindness. It was a good performance. Half the room who had thought her unmanageable and overproud for 2 years were ready to believe it. And he said with the calm of a reasonable man that he would gladly open his own house and his own accounts to any magistrate who wished to put this poison to rest, certain they contained nothing but the plain truth. It was a bluff, and nearly a masterly one. He gambled that no one present could read his books faster than he could, that an offer freely made would seem the very opposite of guilt, that by the time any examination was made he would have had a night alone with his strongbox. He had counted on having that night. He had counted his whole life on being the only one in the room who knew exactly which figure was missing. He had not counted on the river falling. For the Earl of Daventry, finding the lower ford impassable, had not turned back. He had ridden the brown bank upstream in the rain until he found the upper bridge the magistrate had used, and he came into the chapel wet to the knee with the warrant still in his coat, perhaps a quarter of an hour after Sir Conrad rose. He heard the offer made, and understood it for the bluff it was. And the Earl of Daventry, who had spent 3 weeks being told the proof did not yet exist, crossed the chapel floor in his ruined boots to where the magistrate stood, and said the only words the morning needed, 12 of them, level and clear and pitched, to carry to the back pew. He said, "Then open them now, before this room, and let the columns answer." That was all. He did not denounce Sir Conrad, did not raise his voice or claim the floor or make a speech, which he could not have done in any case before a congregation that knew him for a stranger and a rival. He took the guilty man's own offer and refused to let it be postponed. Turning a bluff meant to buy a private night into a public reckoning that no preparation could survive. The minimum sufficient blow struck in the one arena where it could not be parried. Sir Conrad's bluff had been built on time. The Earl had simply taken the time away. The magistrate Garnet, who had read the books through the night and knew precisely what hole to look for, took Sir Conrad's freely offered accounts then and there, in the vestry with the strongbox key produced, before the guardian could find a reason to lose it. And the books did not lie. There was no payment of £3,000 to Sir Whitfield Linley in that year or any year, because the loan had never been made. There was the false bond itself, kept like a relic in the strongbox, sealed and witnessed and damning, never destroyed because a careful forger keeps his instruments. And when the magistrate sent that same day for the clerk Foley, and let him understand that the bond was in a magistrate's hands and the guardian no longer worth perjuring himself for, Foley recanted within the hour, named the thing a forgery he had sworn to for money. And the wall Sir Conrad had built so well came down stone. By careful stone, in a single afternoon. He was not destroyed in the chapel. Justice is slow and procedural and asks for documents and witnesses and the king's commission, and all of those came in their order over the weeks that followed. He was finished from the moment the columns were opened, though, and he knew it, and some witnesses said that the calculation in his pale eyes went out like a snuffed candle when the magistrate's finger came to rest on the place in his own ledger where £3,000 was not. He had built his life on being the only one who could read his books. He was undone by a dead man's daughter who could read them better, and an earl who refused to let him have his quiet night. Eudora learned all of this slowly, in the small house in the village where she had gone to wait for whatever came. She did not know, walking out of the chapel into the cold, whether she had freed herself or merely ruined herself past saving. She knew only that she had told the truth and signed her name to it, and that was the most she had been able to do. She sat in the back bedroom with the trunk emptied at last of its books, and waited to learn what the truth had cost her. What it cost her, in the end, was nothing she was not glad to lose. The neighborhood that had spent 2 years pitying her father's improvidence discovered, with the swiftness of a turning tide, that it had always known there was something not quite right about poor Sir Whitfield's sudden end. The fields of Linley Park came back to her, the bond being void and the acquisition with it. Every acre of the good western grazing restored to the daughter, who had never stopped keeping its accounts in her head. Percival Sturry, who turned out to have known nothing of his uncle's frauds, and to have been only an easy, soft instrument of them, behaved when the truth came out with more grace than she had expected. He came to her once, awkward and ashamed, to say he was glad she had not married him, for she had plainly never wanted to, and in that at least the amiable young man was right. It was 3 days after the chapel that the Earl of Daventry came up the lane to her aunt's house, and did not pretend it was an accident. She saw him from the parlor window, walking through the thin autumn rain in a dark coat, and went out to meet him at the gate, for she would not have him stoop into that close, low parlor for what she somehow knew he had come to say. The marsh stretched gray behind him. The bare trees dripped. He stopped a proper distance away with his hat in his hand and the rain darkening his shoulders, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. 2 people who had spent their whole acquaintance being the only one in the room who saw clearly, and who now had nothing left to be careful about. He said her given name, Eudora. He had never once used it before. Through all those weeks of stolen conversation in lanes and libraries, it had been Miss Linley, always correct and careful. He said it now, standing in the rain. The way a man sets down a weight he has carried a long way, and it landed in the wet quiet between them with more force than any speech. He told her plainly, his voice low and level, that he had come into the Alswick country for his brother, and had stayed for her, and that he had no eloquence to offer, and never had, but that he had watched her keep the truth alive alone for 2 years, when keeping it had cost her everything, and that he had never seen anything he admired more. He would not ask her to be anyone's instrument again. He asked instead whether she might consent to keep her own books in a study at Daventry, with him at the elbow this time, instead of her father, for as long as the 2 of them lived. She did not deflect. She had spent 2 years deflecting, keeping her own counsel because no one had earned the rest of it. She looked up at his hard, clean jaw and his slate-gray eyes, and told him the plain truth, which was that she had stopped being afraid of the cost of things, and that she would. He took her hand, the gloves off, now in the cold, and held it, and did not kiss her. There at the gate in the rain, where any window might be watching, because some things a careful man saves for a threshold that is properly his own. His thumb moved once across her bare knuckles, though slow and deliberate the way his fingers had stayed too long against her glove in the lane a lifetime ago, and the cold morning held its breath around them, and that was enough. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the same small gray chapel with the river low, and the fords passable and no folded paper on the cushion, only a bride who walked the whole length of the aisle this time and meant every step of it. Brearley gave her away in the absence of any nearer man, and wept openly through the whole of it, because he had loved her father, and had never believed the easy story either. She kept her father's books all her life. not the polite ones. Those had served their purpose and were burned. The real ones, the 40 years of cramped, careful entries that had outlasted the men who tried to erase the truth they held. She set the oldest of them on a shelf in the study at Daventry, beside the window that looked out over land she would never lose again. And on the worst gray evenings, when the rain came in off the country the way it had on the morning she lost everything and the morning she got it back, she would take that first ledger down and run one finger along a column that did not lie, and feel her husband come quietly to stand behind her chair. And she would not say anything, and neither would he. Because between two people who had each spent so long being the only one in the room, the not saying had become the whole of the language. Watch the books, her father had told her, with the last breath he had. She had. They had kept the truth when no one else would hear it, and the truth had been slow, as truth in this world is always slow, but it had not been silent forever. A careful woman had outwaited a careful man, and a hard silent earl had crossed a flooded river and a crowded chapel, to give her words a room to be heard in, and a wrong the whole world had agreed to call settled had in the end refused to stay buried. If Eudora's long patience moved you, sit a moment with it before you go. And remember that the quiet ones are only quiet. Until the morning, they are not.